So I think we're ready to start the afternoon session of the conference today, workshop today. So this is always the tough part, right? Sort of following lunch. So we'll see how this goes. But again, thank you for your attendance, your participation. Those of you online, thank you as well. Really glad that you're here and excited about continuing this conversation today. So as you heard earlier this morning, this particular workshop is part of the larger kind of initiative on combating systemic racism launched by IDSS this year. My name is Craig Watkins, visiting professor here, MLK professor here at MIT, faculty at the University of Texas at Austin. At UT Austin, we're doing something similar through a campus-wide initiative called Good Systems, which is in some ways a reference to what we might characterize as ethical or responsible artificial intelligence. And specifically within that, I'm working with a team that's also looking at the ways in which AI might speak to, attend to, and engage issues related to sort of structural racism. So for me, it's been a wonderful opportunity to spend the year here with my colleagues, Peiko, Catherine Fotini, and others who you met this morning, just sort of exploring these issues further and sort of deepening our understanding and knowledge about how we can advance this work forward. So really excited about the panel today. Which is home ownership, lending discrimination, and technology. And I think we have some interesting sort of themes and ideas sort of queued up that in some ways, right, I think will be a great segue from some of the earlier conversations that we heard today, sort of probing further, right, this relationship between fairness and AI, and how do we interrogate some of the assumptions sort of embedded in the ways in which the fairness in AI conversation has evolved, both in terms of in the context of practitioners, but also those who are sort of thinking more holistically, critically, sort of historically about these systems as well. I think a number of interesting, issues from that early panel also speak to the ways in which we broaden, the conversation around how do we think about technology and its relationship to structural inequality. And I think we have some questions, and certainly our panelists here today are poised to address some of those issues in a very striking and significant way as well. So with no further ado, I'd like to get into it. And what I've asked the panelists to do is just to do really brief introductions, about 3 minutes or so, and just kind of who you are, your institution, and some of the areas that you're exploring as it relates to this topic. And I think we have two who are joining us virtually, and so we're looking forward to having them participate in the conversation as well. Maybe we can start, Tawana, with you, and then Pranay, we'll start with you, and then we'll come to our two panelists here in person.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Tawana Petty. I'm here representing Petty Propolis. It is an art organization which also focuses on data and digital privacy and racial equity. I'm joining you from Detroit, Michigan, which is a city that is approximately 80% Black. I'm 45 years old, and for my entire life, it's been a predominantly Black city. And unfortunately, also for my entire life, it's been a city that has been plagued by a dominant, negative, pervasive narrative, which has had an impact on the way that policy shapes our city, how resources are allocated in our city, and just the way the global media and other surrounding communities view Detroit. And that's very relevant to housing. I'm living in a city where the median household income is less than $35,000 per year, but the AMI, area median around housing, is for people who make at least $65,000 per year. And so we're living in a situation where for about a decade, residents in the city were overtaxed by over $600 million, leading to tens of thousands of evictions, tax foreclosures, water shutoffs, and other disparities. And so when I think about like integrated systems or these automated algorithmic systems that are being implemented to make decisions about residents in Detroit, I have to think about the human cost, because for my entire existence within the city, it has been economically unfair. and communities have been extremely marginalized. And so I'm here representing from that perspective, and I'm honored to join you all in such an important discussion.
I'll go next. So my name is Pranay Lohia, and I'm currently working as a senior ML researcher at Microsoft India. And I have more than 6 years of experience working with AI research domain. Before joining Microsoft, I was working as an advisory research engineer at IBM Research. I worked extensively on different AI fairness products like Watson OpenScale and open source toolkits like AI Fairness 360. My works have been published at top conferences like VLDB and ACM FAC. My paper on AI Fairness 360 has close to 600 plus citations. Plus, I have 35 plus patents filed at USPTO. I did my dual degree from IIT Kharagpur, India, in electrical engineering, computer science. Currently, I work on fairness, explainability, and green AI-based solution. I'll be talking and covering the fair credit lending in banking domain. Talking about what's the problem is it that in multi-banking setup, right, where policies for lending like credit score, threshold are handled independently by different banks. However, there would be a single data distribution to represent the entire borrowing population and its characteristics. So what's the problem which comes up, which we have to solve, is that we have to have a multi-round or a long-term simulation understanding to understand the behavior of these models of these different agents, which follows this lending strategy or lending policies. And at the same time, we have to make sure that those are fair models. So what's the situation happens that the output of these models or AI models, right, will be directly or indirectly changing the population distribution. And because of it, there are also multiple enterprises which are operating on the same population distribution because there's a single population distribution on which, because of whether the person pays or repays the loan, the credit score changes, right? Which brings about change in the population distribution. And also, what's the lending policy? Basically, different banks have their own credit score threshold, which they choose. At the same time, there is a regulation which the risk and regulation are maintained by regulators. And their main task is to make sure that the different agents or the banks follow a uniform fair policy which govern throughout the environment. In terms of solution which I've been working on and which it's a part of my research is that can we achieve this fairness in a multi-agent setup? Or we can extend this population distribution to multinary groups because say in example of race, you have white, black, Asian, Hispanic, right? So you need to support wide varieties of protected groups. Can we include multiple fairness matrix, right? There can be different strategies by agents based on what the people choose for the interest rates. Then different agents or different banks follow different strategy in lending. And then at the end, the most important is can the banks follow a dynamic lending policy that in order to sustain their own interest in terms of maximizing their profit, but at the same time making sure that they have ensure a fair strategy towards human population. So that's my bit and looking forward to the entire session. Thanks.
Justin.
My name's Justin Steele. Thanks for having me here. I'm an associate professor of law and urban planning here at MIT. My research focuses mostly on spatial dimensions of inequality and how power is exercised and contested through control over access to particular places. What that means is that one branch of my research focuses on how wealthy white communities use local land use regulations and the structure of local governance to hoard resources and exclude others. Another branch of my research focuses on the nuts and bolts of how discrimination takes place in practice in housing, whether that's by municipalities, by landlords, by lenders, on the basis of race, disability, source of income, family status, through mechanisms like particular tenant screening policies or minimum income, structures of minimum income policies or compensation structures. And a third dimension of my research focuses on environmental justice, especially the effects of climate change related disasters on low income renters and their rents and their evictions and affordable housing production.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacob Faber. I'm an associate professor of sociology and public service at New York University. And I study racial inequality and segregation. Most of that work focuses on the housing market. And I was thinking this morning during the panel and the keynotes about trying something a little bit different for kind of introducing myself. So I'm a sociologist by training, and I think that this kind of event has really pushed me to think about the kind of tools of racial domination, and thinking about the kind of title of this panel, Lending, Discrimination, and Technology, really to think about discrimination as a technology, a social technology where there's a kind of scaffolding that's based on the use of a kind of pseudoscientific logic of racial difference. This discrimination could be kind of explicit at times, certainly, but more often implicit. And this implicit discrimination is justified, again, by these ostensibly scientific logics. You can think back to what Todd presented in the first panel, the homeowners loan corporations kind of appraisal practices, and this kind of driving or coming from both a eugenics movement in academia in the United States in the early 1900s, as well as very large contributions by sociologists at the Chicago School who had developed theories about the value of land as it relates to its distance or proximity to the center of a metropolitan area. And today, and this is also touched on in the first panel, kind of our understandings of risk from a kind of purely economic utilitarian kind of algorithmic basis is also a kind of pseudoscience that is heavily racialized. And then again, kind of thinking about discrimination as this, it's not just interpersonal bias, but it's about kind of constructing a system of, in the case of housing, kind of wealth accumulation for some and exploitation of others. Historically, this is engineering financial products for suburban white wealth accumulation while constraining the housing options of people of color, predominantly blacks living in cities, kind of giving rise to opportunities for exploitation. And this, of course, more recently took the form of the financialization of mortgages during the subprime lending boom. And the adaptive and iterative and self-reinforcing aspects of discrimination as technology kind of show up in kind of exclusion that kind of created slums conditions and then kind of reinforced racist ideas about Black people and Black places that were kind of conflated with those very same slum conditions as well. So I'll kind of wrap it up there and look forward to this conversation.
Thank you all. And Tawana and Pranay, feel free to jump in at any time. As I noted to Justin and Jacob, the idea, right, is that this is a conversation, and so feel free to respond to each other and just participate in a broader conversation. So the first question that I have is directed to Justin and Jacob, but certainly feel free to jump in here. Both of you in your research think a lot about the spatial dimensions of social and economic inequality. And we know that the housing issue, right, is in many respects a spatial issue, right, in terms of where people are distributed, the spaces that they inhabit, and the services and resources available in terms of those particular spaces. I'm wondering first if you could both maybe give us some indication of how you measure spatial inequality, these spatial dimensions of inequality. And then are there some interesting, striking findings or implications of these spatial dimensions of inequality that you find in your work, particularly relevant to this conversation that we're having today as it relates to housing inequality?
Well, to be honest, the kind of measures and methods that I use for evaluating segregation are not that sophisticated. I tend to rely primarily on these kind of industry standard measures of segregation, the isolation index and the exposure index and dissimilarity index. And I do that for a number of reasons. One, they're easy to calculate with freely available data, and they're easy to interpret. And perhaps most importantly, despite the fact that they have these enormous limitations, they are extremely strong predictors of racial inequality and privilege and disadvantage. That said, the biggest limitation of those measures is that they're inherently aspatial. And so there's a big piece that's kind of missing from those measures that more and more work has been kind of dedicated towards, with more sophisticated data availability and methods for understanding kind of how people use and move through spaces. There's kind of a lot of ways to kind of go in that way.
As I think about it maybe taking a step back to the legal architecture of inequality and exclusion today, particularly through our structures of local governance. And I try to think about how to measure two dimensions of that. Because I think what's so significant is that in the United States, unlike a lot of other industrialized countries, we have a very fragmented metropolitan system. But we also really, what's most significant, I think, is that we distribute resources really unequally across the jurisdictions within a metropolitan area compared to a lot of our industrialized peers. And so I guess what's so significant is that this structure of local government makes a home in its location the foundation for access to crucial social, institutional, and public resources in the United States. Most obviously schools, but also access to public open space, public safety. And so I try to think about this in two dimensions. One is kind of measures of jurisdictional proliferation, how many different jurisdictions are there within a metropolitan area, and how's the population distributed across those. But I think even more important is what are the institutional structures that enable those jurisdictions to generate inequality, increasing resource hoarding through tools like exclusionary zoning that keeps particular people out, and fiscal competition, intermunicipal competition. And so I think that is the kind of the foundation on which inequality in home ownership policies is built. I think it's especially problematic because this embedding of inequality, of unequal resources in space obscures some of the causes of socioeconomic inequality and naturalizes it, especially to those who benefit from it, but also to those who are harmed by it. And I think it then sets up processes of reverse redlining and separate and unequal access to credit and home ownership, where we have segmented lending processes that strip resources from communities of color and charge communities of color higher rates for credit products at the same time as they increase home values in whiter neighborhoods.
I think you both also in your work, I think, Jacob, I saw where you refer to these processes in some ways as sort of institutionalized forms of marginalization. And I'm wondering, as we think about sort of the downstream impacts of these spatial dimensions of inequality, is there a particular expression of that you find deeply problematic, troubling in terms of your own research? What are sort of the end results of some of these spatial dimensions of inequality in terms of how they directly impact the quality of people's lives, how they experience the communities that they're in, and life chances, opportunities, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so there's a kind of growing and really powerful body of research showing that segregation of people by poverty and racial concentration affects basically every aspect of life. That from upward mobility to political efficacy to life expectancy, success in school and the workplace, and it's hard to really kind of pinpoint one specific kind of even set of actors, and I think that's in part because of the kind of hegemonic role that place has played in shaping conceptions of race. So, George Lipsitz has this, Racism Takes Place, he makes this argument that because of the way that we've developed our metropolitan areas, cities kind of contested with suburbs, the kind of concept of whiteness is kind of inseparable from the concept of the kind of single detached suburban home, whereas the concept of blackness is just as tied to kind of urban decay. And this, carries forward through institutions like public school funding, and then on the family and an individual level in terms of wealth accumulation. And so it's this kind of conceptual institution or kind of cultural norm that tends to be the most kind of destructive because it pervades basically everything we do.
And I like to chime in and say, as much, and we have all this analysis, right? We understand the racial inequality, we understand the digital redlining, we understand the systemic and structural, institutional, and all of the racisms. And yet, and still in predominantly Black communities, brown communities, indigenous communities, we're seeing this creep up of hyper-surveillance that is refusing to address all of those inequalities and has determined that automating these systems and creating a panopticon around these cities is the way that we address the quality of life issues that may lead to quality of life crime. And so narrative plays a tremendous role in how we have been unable to move over the hump. We have a lot of academic analysis around all of these institutions and structures that have created harm, and yet we cannot, for some reason, get to a humane space and way of addressing the issues that are being imposed upon these communities that have been divested in for so long. And so, yeah, I'm agreeing with everything is said, but I think as we move forward, we're in a whole nother realm of how communities of color are experiencing these systems. And it's very violent. I mean, I live in a city that is surrounded by mass surveillance helicopters, surveillance drones, surveillance cameras, face recognition, and yet overtaxed housing hasn't been addressed. And so, the ways we're experiencing living in cities right now has a direct psychological, emotional, and physical impact on how we live in our homes. Like, what does it feel like to live in a city as a Black or brown person or a person living in poverty today with all these systems being integrated and automated and racial equity not being centered?
And also one of the important point to look here would be also what are the causal aspect which has brought about this situation, like whether there have been past change in the rules in the administration or housing policy which had happened right in the past, maybe 20 years back, 30 years back. But because of that transition, they keep on causing new changes, new behaviors. And now we are at this point where there are a lot of issues with respect to housing related to whether it's social or economic minority groups.
No, thank you, and Tawana, thank you for that. We're very aware of your work, and so we'll be coming back to you in a moment to talk about how you're addressing some of those issues on the ground, which I think connect to some other conversations that we had earlier this morning. So this question is to all of you, but maybe we can start, Tawana, with you and Pranay. So in your respective work, I think you have each identified interesting, what we might characterize as institutional agents, right? So these issues are very complex. They cut across many different domains, many different institutions. There are many different institutional players involved here. And I'm wondering, right, could each of you think in terms of your own respective work and investment in this space, is there a particular institutional agent, mortgage lenders, algorithmic systems, database systems, real estate agents, are there particular institutional agents that stand out for you in terms of how we might begin to better understand the ways in which the housing crises, housing inequality, and all of the downstream effects sort of associated with that emerge? And I'm wondering, right, if there's a particular agent that you find particularly important in terms of your own work and the ways in which you try to understand and approach this problem.
Yeah. What I think in terms of lending, right, like I take mortgage lenders as one of the important agent, because the primary aspect of them is that they will give loan primarily on credit score of a person, right? And the problem here comes at, suppose there's an individual coming from a social or economic minority background, right? And to begin with, they have a low credit score. So it becomes very difficult for that person, whether him or her, right, to achieve or get loan because their credit score is low. And now in order to achieve a higher credit score, they need to take loan from a lender, right? And mortgage lender won't take that risk of lending loans to a person who has a low credit score. So that's the problem which happens.
Yeah, and I'll say, something I referenced earlier about the AMI, considering a larger regional geographic area, and if that larger geographic area has, a much higher income base, and then you're viewing a city like Detroit, and I like to center place-based. I know we kind of talked about that, which is why I'm choosing to lift up Detroit. Because it is a city that you can find all of these layers collaborating to create this inequality. And so when you look at an AMI that's saying the median household income says that you should be able to afford this type of home or this type of rent at this income, and it completely bypasses the income of 80% of the residents in a large city, that's a situation that if it's not addressed and we don't take into consideration that city's AMI, then we can't undo that inequality. And so there have been some attempts in Detroit to do like a Detroiters Bill of Rights, trying to shift the AMI to just focus on what the household income is for Detroiters. And we were not successful because the power of narrative to shape communities of color prevents, this wide scale groundswell of people saying, hey, those folks actually deserve to not pay as much as the people who live a city over who make 5 times their income. And so there hasn't been a real serious consideration around things like that. Folks just feel like we got to figure out the bootstrap thing and get people to be able to lift themselves up, even if bootstraps don't exist in particular households. And so, yeah, I'd say we have to take a serious look at how we're setting the AMI for communities that don't have high income.
Justin and Jacob, how about you? Are there particular institutional agents that you focus on in your work that you find critical to understanding some of these conditions that we're addressing today?
Sure. So in some of my work on the social structure of mortgage discrimination, I think there's a lot of focus on the loan originators and the lenders, but I was trying to trace the structure of power as it moved up to the secondary mortgage market investors and the investment banks that were setting the terms for the loans that they wanted. And so I think we have to keep looking up in that direction. But in the work that I've been doing more recently on housing discrimination and thinking about the topics for today of this intersection of data and housing, a few other things came to mind. So one was this intersection of basically different traditional agents in the housing search home ownership process with new technology platforms. So for instance, online brokers. There's an interesting case going on right now, the National Fair Housing Alliance versus Redfin, that's highlighting the racial disparities in who Redfin serves based on some of the kind of minimum home value thresholds that they set. And then in terms of online advertising, National Fair Housing Alliance has a case that's settled against Facebook, given Facebook's offering online housing advertisers the ability to choose to target their advertising by race. And the same thing with tenant screening, that a lot of landlords are now moving towards more technological widespread platforms for tenant screening. And there's a case, the Connecticut Fair Housing Alliance versus CoreLogic, highlighting the inclusion of arrest data with a disparate impact. And I think what's been most concerning to me in that research is actually the role of credit scores. And there's obviously the big 3 credit agencies, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, but how credit scores have come to serve as a form of exclusion from so many things, from mortgage financing to just tenants' access to apartments to jobs. and how credit scores have this entrenched inequality built into them that's very hard to pinpoint as much as we would like, given the kind of proprietary nature of the credit score. So that's one that's really on my mind.
And just to piggyback on a piece of what you said, just yesterday I was at an event with a group of real estate agents, and the event was structured such that there was a screening of a short animated video that was based on Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, that talks about the kind of history of housing exclusion through public policy. And after the screening, there was then a kind of conversation, and they saw this video, this presentation of all this historical facts about policies that have excluded people of color from homeownership opportunities, and the reaction is like, why is black homeownership rate so low? Do we need more black real estate agents? And it's like, well, just like pump the brakes here. First of all, were you totally zoned out during this first 17 minutes where we're talking about this? And I think that there's, all of the panelists have mentioned the really deep financial ties that this industry and all the pieces of this industry have to inequality. In this discussion yesterday, I brought up the fact that the real estate industry has donated more money to Republican candidates than Democratic candidates in every election since 1994. And so there's a real kind of entrenched resistance to change in that industry.
This is a question that also is to each of you. So the title of this, today's event is Beyond Fairness. And of course, there's a very robust conversation happening here and beyond around what we might characterize as fair artificial intelligence, fair machine learning. If you were here for part of the panel, the first panel this morning, some interesting conversations regarding that concept, that term. I guess what I'd like to do is to sort of interrogate some of the assumptions associated with quote unquote fair artificial intelligence, and to ask, right, is simply building fair models enough, right? If we think about the need to pursue equity, the need to pursue justice, how does that sort of reorient how we might think about the fairness debate or the fairness conversation? And I know each of you, probably come at this through a very different kind of perspective, expertise, but I'm curious, right, how would you encourage us to sort of think about, to interrogate some of these assumptions around fair AI and other alternatives, other ways of thinking about this in terms of what these systems might be able to do in terms of addressing deep systemic sort of structural inequalities?
Yeah. So maybe I can go ahead. So basically what we take fairness in AI is basically removal of this unwanted bias which is present in our AI system, right? And this include at different stages of model pipeline, whether it can be from the data collection or the data handling. You do feature engineering, you have some sort of model training, deployment, and then post-model deployment, right? But at the core of it, we define the entire ethics domain in three forms, like fairness, equity, and justice. And the main aim of this entire ethics in AI is to achieve the real goal of justice, right? And for that, we need to identify the root cause of this bias. And then once we have identified those, the main aim or the problem to solve is how can we mitigate them, or what are the strategies we can use to mitigate them, or maybe remove these sort of biased data sources or human opinion from our the entire pipeline.
I'll say one of my late mentors, Grace Lee Boggs, used to always tell me, Tawana, sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. And what I'd love to see in the machine learning world is more questions. And it feels like there aren't enough questions that ask, should this exist in the world? Who told us this should exist in the world? Who's impacted by what's going to exist in the world? And then how do we make sure that there's a constant revisiting of those communities that are probably going to be harmed by the system that's being designed. There isn't enough back and forth and collaborated, coordinated, and consistent communication between the communities that are going to receive the output that's created through these systems. And that is one of the problems. And so through a lot of the ethics work that I've been a part of out of necessity, I find a lot of pushback like, hey, we don't even have time to think about that while we're trying to do this thing. Well, how about we stop doing the thing and we start thinking about it ahead of time? And so I'm not saying that there aren't some brilliant technologists and data scientists and AI ethicists and whatever other field touches on this, doing that work, but I don't see enough of it. And it seems like it's always too late to interject that discussion around justice into the equation. Then we spend a lot of time on the ground in communities, number one, trying to understand the system, and then number two, trying to figure out how to advocate for ourselves, and number three, being really disappointed because it's too late and the harm has already been done.
Yeah. If I could just bring back up a kind of question that was thrown out in the first panel, which is, fairness for who? And to me, I think that the concept of fairness is kind of woefully inadequate for, and I much strongly prefer kind of redress or repair. If we were, with a magic wand, able to completely eliminate racial bias in the world tomorrow, we would still see intergenerational inequality in housing opportunity and wealth accumulation because of historical wrongs. And even if we balanced out wealth with that, we would still see persistence of inequality because of the geography of inequality and how we kind of distribute opportunities and disadvantages unequally across populations. So I would much rather, sure, interpersonal bias is important to address. Algorithmic bias is important to address, but it shouldn't be our focus.
I would just reiterate about what both Tawana and Jacob were saying. I think it's important to ask this AI or this machine learning for who and for what, and fairness for who and for what, I think, is the fundamental question. And I think when people talk about fairness, it means different things to different people, but it often is understood to mean without kind of explicit discrimination, and it's kind of consistent with an anti-discrimination perspective. They're like, what we're trying to avoid is intentional discrimination. But I think that's a fundamentally flawed understanding, as Jacob was saying and as Tawana was saying, of how racial inequality is perpetuated today. And I think we have to have what I would call an anti-subordination perspective that understands that we're starting from a place where even if there was all of a sudden wealth equality, we would still have unequal outcomes. And so we need to have anti-subordination approaches that are aimed at actually creating equal outcomes. And so I think that's where I would say we should point ourselves.
Yeah. Tawana, I want to direct this question to you, and others certainly feel free to contribute. I would say, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of your work sort of happens in what I think is a really compelling space that we might characterize as data justice. And in terms of the work that you're doing on the ground, the work that you're doing there in Detroit, in that community, in your work, you talk a lot about the conflation between surveillance and safety, or consent and coercion. And I'm wondering, if you could talk a bit about that conflation and how you think it's implicated in the housing crises that we find ourselves facing, and its relationship to structural forms of inequality.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think a lot about the relationship that community members have in a city where they know that they cannot afford the resources that are necessary to live their lives, but they're forced into a circumstance where you have to try and almost pretend that you can, or you have to try and figure out how to go without water or medication, or maybe your child can't have school books because you need electricity, and all of these trade-offs with regard to living a robust life, and the types of data extraction that happen when you have to go and get a payday loan, as an example, so that you can afford your rent. And so that's what I think of when I talk about consent and coercion. It's like, well, this person agreed to do this thing. But really, did they have a choice in the matter? If you want to live, if you want to be able to afford your home, if you want to be able to pay your rent, you're going to try to do anything possible to get your income to that level that that AMI, so that you can afford to live in your city. And that's going to create a massive amount of debt, which means that now you're integrated into these systems that are targeting you for water you can't afford, taxes you can't afford, and all these other systems. And with regard to surveillance and the conflation between surveillance.
Tawana, can you hear us? Okay. Hopefully we'll get her back.
Yeah, so they need to reconnect.
I don't know if did anyone else want to respond, or we'll see if we can get her back. I know Peko, do we want to do, I have another question, but do we want to do, are there any questions that you're seeing that you want to share with the panelists?
I do have a couple, but why don't you ask yours first, and then we'll switch to these.
Okay. Okay, so I think my next question was going to play a little bit off of what Tawana was saying, so I'll have to kind of improvise here a little bit and go to the next question. Pranay, which I'll direct to you. I think in your slide, and certainly in your work, you talk about ways in which you might achieve fairness or equity in what you characterize as these sort of multi-organization scenarios. Could you talk a bit about, or explain a bit about what you mean by that, and how your research in this space in some ways is addressing that particular issue?
So basically what we are taking is that in real life, right, when there's a lending scenario, there is a human population group, right? And then there are multiple banks which the person can approach. And then there is these multiple banks look upon these human population as in terms of credit score, right? And so this is the problem which we formulate in terms of like a multi-agent strategy, right? Where there are two goals of these agents. Right? The agents, I mean the banks. The two goals are, first of all, they would want to earn profit by giving loans, right? They need a good reward. But at the same time, when there is a regulation, they need to have a fair strategy. And this brings about an optimization problem, that a trade-off needs to be built between fairness and the profit which the bank sees, right? And my goal is that can we come up with this equilibrium problem solution, right? Which makes sure that the banks also earn enough reward, but at the same time, there's a fairness involved with respect to a minority group, whether it's a social or an economic minority group.
And I'll pretend to be Tawana for a second.
I'm back.
I think
Is she back?
Oh, yes.
She is.
Okay, so we have the real thing. Sorry.
My apologies. I'll be really quick. I think you heard the surveillance and safety conflation, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just say I'm sorry, the coercion consent. I'll just say with regard to surveillance and safety, when you're living in a predominantly Black, brown, indigenous, poor community, and the narrative is that, the folks there have to be contained, and that means that you start to create systems, mainly surveillance systems, to try and control that community. And so that's a sort of forced consent. And so it really does dominate the ways that we navigate our cities. Am I going to go to that grocery store because that grocery store has face recognition? Or am I able to go here? I owe debt because I can't afford to live in my home. So you're going to start to navigate. There's going to be a bit of a way that you navigate your city that you wouldn't in a more fair, equitable situation. And so when we conflate surveillance with safety, we don't put mechanisms in place that create a safe situation for the community members that live there.
No, great. One of the things that your work and the work of others, and even some of the conversations that we heard earlier this morning, it's very easy to sort of think of these issues in a sort of top-down way, right? So what are big powerful tech companies doing? What are regulators and policymakers doing? What are academics and scholars doing? But it seems to me, right, that if we really want to sort of understand and drive real change, that we have to think of this not only as a top-down matter, but also kind of bottom up, for lack of a better term. And I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about that in terms of how do we empower, right, community stakeholders? How do we engage community stakeholders to be able to exercise, right, their voice, their perspective, their expertise, their experience in shaping how we try to create a more just housing future? Any thoughts or anything from your research that suggests where there may be opportunities to do that, or do you see incentives or reasons to do that? In other words, right, trying to expand, right, who we bring into this conversation and how it might impact, right, to the point that was made by some of you and even the earlier panel, even the questions that we ask, right? If you bring in different stakeholders who provide a different perspective, a different lens, how they see these issues and how they frame these issues might be very different, and therefore might expand how we understand and pursue our own respective work.
I would just say I think that that's really fundamental if we are trying to move beyond fairness in AI and trying to advance housing justice and racial justice. I think the only way that's going to happen is if we're really working with community members, community-based organizations, coalitions, and in Boston, there's a great grassroots housing organization, City Life Vida Urbana, that's been a big player in conversations about housing policy in the region. And I think we've witnessed in the past 5 years the incredible momentum that tenants' rights organizations and other housing justice organizations like Homes for All and Right to the City and others have really transformed conversations about housing and housing affordability and zoning reform, tenants' rights. And so I think that that's really where the energy is coming from, and I think that's where we should be focusing our attention and our listening.
Great. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna turn to the audience and see if there's any questions. There's one over here. Okay. You and then I'll come back over here. There you go.
Thank you all for a great panel so far. I guess I was wondering, I was really interested in that question Professor Watkins had asked about agents that are important to your work to sort of scrutinize. And I was wondering, I've been back to MIT in about a decade and just seeing sort of the expansion of the university and sort of the new securitization of all the MIT buildings, how the academy and the university is showing up in some of the issues you all are looking at.
Ooh.
It's I think it's a really good and crucial question. I'm an academic, but have this kind of ambivalence about the role of the academy in communities. We were talking a little bit about this last night, right, at dinner, and I made a tired joke that I've made before, which is that I'm employed by a real estate corporation that masquerades as an educational institution. NYU is, I think, the third largest landholder in New York City. When I did my undergraduate work here at MIT, and I remember when I was here, the City Council of Cambridge tried to get MIT to close down the research nuclear reactor that's in Central Square, and MIT was like, no, we're just not going to do that. And I think at the time, I'm sure this number is much larger today, but at the time, I think MIT and Harvard today, in the early 2000s, owned about 40% of the land in Cambridge. And so, the international version of the story is even more obscene. There's, these universities are bullies. They're really bullies, and they operate like any kind of Fortune 500 company would operate in terms of kind of land use decisions, manipulating local politics, suppressing dissent, and being beholden to the board of directors, which for most academic institutions is populated by extraordinarily wealthy people.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you all for a wonderful conversation. I had a question that I want to follow up on the credit score question, particularly what Pranay has mentioned, but also the rest of you. So I just want to hear your response to the following argument that is often made, and that is credit scores are about estimation of risk. They're based on metrics that have nothing to do with your color or your background, and they provide this information to regulators and bankers, after which these guys decide to make a decision whether to give you a loan or not. Yet at the same time, somehow that single instrument has become very dominant. And the question is, how do you argue, back to the sort of discrimination as a technology, how do you argue against credit scores when they make such an argument?
I would think, the first thing I would start by saying is they're not, and I don't have the strongest data to base this on, but I don't think we should accept that they're not correlated with race, because I think they, as we talked about, what's the starting point for all of this? If we're starting from, going back to the keynote talk at lunch, before lunch and the prior conversation, if we're starting from a starting place where we've had a history of racialized expropriation of land and wealth that has driven dramatic wealth inequalities, that's obviously going to appear in the credit score. And I think the argument that I would make is that there's lots of other things that would be a better assessment, say, for instance, of people's likelihood to pay rent, such as their history of paying rent, would be a much more accurate signal for paying rent. And a credit score, which is really tied to racialized inequalities of wealth, would be to take that one experience. Or, for a job, people's history of job performance would probably be a better indicator of their future job performance than, something that incorporates this racialized history of unequal wealth.
Does anybody know how a credit score is calculated? Sorry. Does anybody know how a credit score is calculated? It's proprietary, right? So, if they want to say it's not about race, they can prove that if they would like. But I very much feel like the credit score question is kind of a trap. And I kind of disagree a little with Pranay that I don't think that banks kind of see communities as different groups of credit scores. I think they see communities as sites for capital accumulation. So, for example, and I'm very glad, Tawana, you brought up the example of kind of being compelled to use payday lenders. Megan B., who's at the University of Wisconsin, has shown that the banks that finance payday lenders avoid the neighborhoods of the payday lenders that they finance. Because they don't want to get in competition with their own exploitative business. And the subprime lending crisis was a perfect example of the unobjectiveness of evaluating people by credit score. The Wall Street Journal, of all places, conducted research showing that half of subprime borrowers should have qualified for prime loans. Work of my own showed that Black and Latino borrowers making $250,000 a year were more likely to get subprime loans than white borrowers making $35,000 a year. So again, I feel like this kind of narrow, kind of hyper technocratic kind of discussion about this one kind of catch-all measure is a trap in that it is not a catch-all measure for a large portion of mortgage lending.
Yeah, and also to add there, apart from maybe the protected attributes like race, gender, and all, there are other aspects like income and location, right? Because as in research, we say those as indirect bias attributes, because you have removed those direct specific stuff from your data or information, but there are indirect relations, which are causal relations, which has impacted because of some past dependencies and all, right? And because of those, it can happen. Let's take an example, what Tawana mentioned, right? That say Detroit has more black community people, right? And even though you remove the information of race from your data, the location of Detroit will impact that bank decision, right? So they might have to take decision. They might be taking at the back of their algorithm decision based on the location, which directly is causing those bias still, right? So that's my point to add.
So I'll ask a
Say,
final.
I would just, I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead, Tawana.
I was just going to say really quickly, we just have to move beyond trying to put neutrality in any of these systems. It is not, it doesn't exist. And even if, as was mentioned, there's proprietary data that we can't get access to, there's enough of a history of how it's playing out in particular communities to kind of make an assessment that there is racial inequality at play. And so I think, we have to start at that point about the harms. What harms have been created by these systems and work our way from there.
I'll wrap it up with, if you remember, Peko and Catherine at the beginning of the day ask us to sort of think about, kind of conversations we would like to have with people, across our disciplinary silos or your professional sort of expertise. And so I'll direct this question toward the panel, but it's also meant for all of us here to sort of think about. So these are obviously complex issues which cut across a number of different sort of disciplines, domains, institutional practices, histories, et cetera, et cetera. As you think about your own work, right, and the ways in which you want to advance greater equity and justice in this space, could you give us, and each of you maybe just take 1 minute for sake of time here, who would you like to engage in conversation or engage in partnership outside of your own sort of, sphere of expertise and domain that you think might help you better understand and advance your vision for what you see as a more just future?
I'd like to get out of the way and kind of get folks like City Life Vida Urbana, Homes for All, other housing justice and racial justice organizations in the room with regulators and also a lot of the kind of decision makers who we've talked about before, landlords, investment banks, and kind of get their advocacy more powerfully in those spaces.
It's a really good question, and I've been thinking about my own kind of personal theory of change for a while now, and I don't know. Honestly, I think I kind of go back and forth on this all the time, and where I often kind of find myself kind of gravitating towards is youth, is kind of talking to younger generations, which is part of the kind of joy and privilege of being a university professor.
Renee and Tawana, who would you like to sort of expand to talk to?
So as coming from an industry like Microsoft, right, what we currently do as part of our research also is that when we have certain outcome, we formulate them in terms of policies, and then we talk to government organizations. Then in India, you have something like Niti Aayog or NASSCOM, right, which directly links between industry like Microsoft and government organization. And at the end, our goal is that can we come up with these fair policies in, say, lending, housing, and all that? And then we want our policies to reach to government so that they can implement those policies on ground. So that's always our goal, is to reach through certain administrative divisions like Niti Aayog to Indian government and help to bring about the real change on ground.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll say, in addition to my very intentional efforts to learn from folks like you who are working more in a technological field and working around machine learning, I also really value intergenerational dialogue. The young people who are on the front lines of the struggle, who are experiencing these systems probably even before they reach our radar, as well as the elders, if I think about the senior citizens in Detroit who were on the front lines of losing their homes and I'm talking about homes they owned, to massive overtaxation. And so the intergenerational dialogue is tremendous.
Well, on that note, I want to say thank you to the panelists for your expertise and for sharing your time with us today. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think we have a
Quick 15-minute break while we get set up for the next panel. So everybody stretch your legs, but we'll try to reconvene in about, actually, 13 minutes.